thanks very much for coming. Coming out on Mother's Day. When I found today was Mother's Day, I was like, but yeah, it's great to see you all here. I'm a founder and co-founder and director of the Sortition Foundation. We just celebrated our first birthday the other day. It's been 1 year since we became an incorporated not-for-profit, a legal entity that can campaign to change our politics. In the past year, we've just been building our structures and getting a few things done. We've published a document called a Citizens' Assembly for the Scottish Parliament, where we propose, with a group in Scotland called Conway, to have a second chamber in the Scottish Parliament created from randomly selected people, a Citizens' Assembly if you like. Conway are a pro-independence group, and their thought is that if Scotland does become independent, they want a house of review to constrain the politicians up there, and so they got in touch and we've developed that paper which you can find online. We also made a submission to the Irish Citizens' Assembly about how to do referenda better. The basic proposal was that before any referenda you should have a Citizens' Assembly of informed, deliberating people who come to the considered judgment about the referendum question, and this is then distributed to all the people so that they can know what a random representative sample of the people actually think about this referendum topic. If that had been done here, you might have had a different result. We're also trying to organise a G1000 in Cambridge. This is where you randomly select 1,000 people, put them in a room to talk about what they'd like to see happen in their local district, and then try to include the councillors and hopefully get them to implement those decisions. The G1000 started in Belgium a few years ago. It's moved to the Netherlands where they've held 10 or 20 of these events. It's moved to Spain. We're trying to bring it to the UK. We're also part of an international network called Democracy R&D, which is groups from all over the world who are doing sortition, who are randomly selecting people on policy juries and citizens' assemblies to talk about a wide array of policy issues: climate change, migration, safe streets, cycle routes, big things, small things, energy infrastructure, budgets. Across every item that they discuss, they come up with trusted decisions. That group met for their first time in Madrid in January, so they're also a very new group. I've also published a book called The End of Politicians last year. You can grab a copy over there at the end if you so desire, where I outline all these arguments in more detail. You can look at the references, etc. Did a TEDx talk last year as well, trying to again promote these ideas. If you want to send a 10-minute version to your friends, you can do that. I keep mentioning sortition. If you're wondering what is this word, I keep saying it's just random selection. It's the use of random selection to populate an assembly so that you get a representative sample of people. But we'll talk a lot more about that as we go. Before we do that, we should make sure we're clear on what's democracy, because it's not at all an agreed upon term. There's no real consensus on what defines a democracy. I'll actually throw it to you. What do you think defines a democracy? Yell some words at me.
Representative people.
Will of the people, representative, voting, elections, this kind of stuff. If you look at the definitions out there, they're all quite different, but there's two that come again and again. Something to do with equality, that's where voting comes in, one person, one vote. Something to do with public control, that's where the will of the people comes in, that the popular sovereignty, the people are in control of the people making those decisions. Will try to convince you, or maybe you're already convinced, that elections fail in key respects in both of these terms. The first past the post system, there are many wasted votes in an election. There's safe seats. Basically, if you know that seat is going to go to the Conservatives or to Labour, then the people who are determining who is in Parliament are basically those in control of the pre-selection. What does that mean for equality if all the people outside of that very small group are excluded? What about non-citizens who can't vote? What about immigrants, refugees who pay taxes, live here, can't influence who makes the laws? What about systemic inequality? Study after study shows that you are more likely to vote, to engage in politics if you are better educated, if you are older, etc. Economic inequality severely impacts political equality. That's very well studied and founded. What about in terms of public control? Well, most people who study democracy say, oh, well, it's actually elite bargaining, very loosely constrained elite bargaining. At election time, you get to decide which faction of the elites are in control. They will then be constrained by the powerful corporations, media conglomerates, etc., amongst themselves to work out what goes on. Media influence, party donors, vested interests, all these things are very well known, understood. I don't think they're very controversial. There's some very interesting studies in the US where they look at the views, opinions of the wealthy, the middle class and the poor, and they look at what legislation is being passed, and they find that, of course, when the middle class and the wealthy views align, then that's what you get. But what they find is that when the middle class and the wealthy views diverge, it invariably goes the way of the wealthy. I won't even mention the poor, because they're more or less off the radar. This is a US study, of course, but I suspect very similar things are happening all across the world. Elections are very blunt instruments. If you want to reward or punish someone, if you have a choice of two and you don't like either of them, or there's lots of critiques you can aim at democracy in those spheres. There's a great book by Arkins and Bartels called Democracy for Realists, Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Governments, where he calls this theory that we all vote in the elections and the politicians respond to how we vote and that we're actually in control. He calls this the folk theory of democracy, unproven. What the social scientists say is that we actually vote to confirm our membership of a certain social group. You vote because all your friends do that way, and you want to, by making that vote, you're making a statement about yourself, about what sort of person you are. You don't vote given a general consideration of all the wide policy options and how that might actually affect you, etc., etc. Very interesting book. Equality and public control is further undermined by things like the gender imbalance in our parliaments. Okay, this is the US Congress, but of course it's very similar over here. You can see a large distortion towards older men. In the UK it's very similar. If you add the House of Lords, it's even worse. The average age of someone in the House of Lords is 69, almost 70. That's the average age of these people who have quite a bit of power. If you look at the wealth imbalance, it's neither more shocking. This is a logarithmic scale. It goes from 10,000 to 100,000 to 1 million. This scale is crazy. Again, this is the US where it's far more pronounced than here, but still, I'm sure it's quite pronounced. If 50% of your legislators are millionaires, what kind of legislation is going to be passed? If you have to be a millionaire to be elected, what does that mean about equality and popular control? So it's easy to undermine this popular conception of our functioning democracy. Now I'm going to jump into the bulk of the talk, and what I'm going to do is slowly step backwards in time until we get to the birthplace of democracy. Then we're going to leap back to the future. That's the structure of the talk. This is data that is collected by George Mason University in the US, where they try to measure how democratic a country is. Interestingly, a democracy, it's not a binary proposition. It's not that you are either a democracy or not a democracy, because if you try to measure countries, you find that there's a sliding scale. There are countries that aren't democratic at all. There are some that are a little bit democratic, some that are quite democratic. And so they have a scale from -10 for an autocracy to +10 for a perfect democracy. This is the countries with a score of 6 or more. But I could have chosen 7, I could have chosen 5. It changes the graph a little bit. But this whole idea that democracy is not a binary is also very important. What you'll find is that there's a very slow increase up to World War I. We survived World War I. We had the Great Depression, the rise of Nazism, fascism, collapse as Hitler invaded various countries. In the midst of World War II, this data says there was 9 democracies left on the planet. No one really thought democracy would make a big comeback, and there was actually quite a few people saying, yes, thank God that's done. It did. It bounced back. The era of decolonisation, fall of the Berlin Wall, we get this impressive increase that everyone goes, phew, great, that's all good. But we should remind ourselves that this is still only about half the countries on the planet. Authoritarian capitalism is still, as practiced in China and Saudi Arabia, etc., is still a challenge to democracy. We haven't actually won that. Even if it is becoming a global norm, there's still very many people who are looking the other way. So, what I'm going to do is start here and start jumping backwards and keep going. My first leap is quite a leap, going back to the 50s and 60s. What do people think of when they think of the 50s and 60s?
Rock and roll.
Oh, I like it. Yep. I picked television and Elvis. I'm not going to do an Elvis impersonation. This is a politics discussion later. Okay, but we're here to talk about democracy. So, what happened in the 50s and 60s? In 1948, the UK passed the Representation of the People Act, which was put into practice in 1950. It abolished plural voting. Before that time, people could vote more than once if you held a property in a separate constituency. If you were a member of Cambridge University, Oxford University, people could vote up to 3 times if you had a property here, lived there, and were also a member of the university. They finally abolished plural voting in 1948. They estimate that roughly 7% of the population could vote more than once before that time. In 1958, women were finally let into the House of Lords. Took quite a while, but they eventually got there. In the US, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a direct response to Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, abolished all the hurdles for voter registration for African Americans in the US. In Australia, where I'm from, Indigenous voting rights were secured between 62-65, where they forced states to let Aborigines enrol to vote. In 67, they even voted to include them in the referendum data, which changed the size of constituencies and how many votes, how you would vote for people. So my key point here is, with all this data, with all this, if you exclude people from voting or give people more than one vote, are they really democracies before that point? If democracy is fundamentally about equality, were they a democracy? Let you think about that. Let's take another step, another 20, 30, 40 years back. Where do we get to? The suffragettes, the suffragettes. It's 100 years today that some women got the right to vote in the UK, if you were rich or married to a rich man. In 1928, females, women, finally got equal rights with men here in the UK. In the US in 1919, 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. In Switzerland in 1971. Ouch. In Australia in 1902, in New Zealand 1893, but these women couldn't stand for election. It's actually more complex than this, actually, because there's various sub-national entities that could get the right to vote. The colony of South Australia, as it was called back then, gave women the right to vote a bit earlier, and Finland was up there as well. But in general, at the turn of the century, women couldn't vote, African Americans couldn't vote, Indigenous people in Australia couldn't vote. Were they democracies? On our graph I showed before, was that actually a democracy? I'll let you decide. While we're on that, let's do a slight detour to young adults and their voting rights. The voting age was typically 23 to 30 in the late 20th century, 30 in Denmark, 25 in Belgium. In the UK it was reduced to 21 in 1928, lowered to 18 in 1969. In the US, the 26th Amendment lowered it to 18 in 1971. 18, 19, 20-year-old US citizens were being conscripted, sent to Vietnam to kill and be killed, but they could not actually vote to change the government that was sending them there until 1971. Various groups are pushing still further. In Lower Saxony, they lowered it to 18. 3 Austrian states have also done so. 16, sorry, what did I say?
18.
Cheers, 16. In Scotland, the voting age was lowered to 16 in time for the Scottish referendum in 2014. There's been this shift again and again to define younger people as eligible voters, as adults, to give them equality, to give them a say. So, we take another step back. Now we're through the 1900s, into the 1800s. This was the era where universal suffrage became a widespread used term. Of course, it meant just for men, because that's the universe, apparently. In 1848, all men were given the right to vote, regardless of property or wealth qualifications. In the US, in theory, in 1870, but not in practice. In the South, they put very many hurdles up to stop African Americans enrolling. In the UK, in 1918, you eliminated property and wealth qualifications on the right to vote. Before this time, you had to either pay a minimum amount of tax or own a certain amount of property to vote. These were not called democracies. No one called them democracies because they weren't democracies. They were constitutional monarchies. They were constitutional republics. At the Gettysburg Address in 1863, Lincoln says, "Democracy of the people, by the people, for the people, except women, African Americans, poor people." His concept of the people was obviously rather restrictive. So, what happened in the 1800s? Well, one key event was a French guy, Alex de Tocqueville, excuse my French, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. He visited the US, was very impressed, and published a couple of books called Democracy in America. And people went, "Wow, he's calling it a democracy, that's pretty funny. Maybe we should actually call it a democracy, what we have here." And the name stuck. Soon they were actually using, we should install democracy in Mexico, and they took over modern-day Texas. So I'm not sure why the US was called the first democracy in our graph that I showed before in 1809. There were so many exclusions that by any modern standard it wouldn't be called a democracy. If we keep going backwards, we get to the 1700s. Okay, these crucial revolutions that more or less defined the start of the modern era. The US Revolution, French Revolution, the UK Glorious Revolution a bit earlier. In the US, the Founding Fathers were profoundly anti-democratic. You can read the text where they argue against pure democracy and for a republican government, where the widespread nature and the restricted voting rights, you only let rich men vote, then you'll get the proper kind of people in the Senate making the laws. In France, what happened in France? Okay, you had the aristocracy and the nobility, and then you had this new class of people. You had the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, you had capitalism, the birth of capitalism, and the rise of the bourgeoisie. Throughout history, you would typically find that economic power and political power is strongly in alignment. What happened in France was that you had a divergence. You had the political power in the hands of the aristocracy, and economic power was shifting to a new group, the bourgeoisie. They basically killed each other, and who got power? The bourgeoisie. Although they did write a constitution that gave all men the right to vote, it was never implemented, and the constitution they did implement had a definition called active citizenship, where you had to pay a certain minimum of taxes. This didn't really get far either before Napoleon came along, declared himself emperor, and then they returned to a monarchy. So, this 1700s, the key parts of these people, the key actors in these revolutions, were not Democrats. Certainly not. The term was used. It was often used, for example, Jean-Paul Marat, one of the famous radicals from the French Revolution. What would we have gained by destroying the aristocracy of birth if it is replaced by an aristocracy of the rich? Very prophetic, I would say. You might dismiss him as a radical trying to drum up support on the streets, so let's ask John Adams, second US president. Is not representation an essential and fundamental departure from democracy? Is not every representative government in the universe an aristocracy? Representation and democracy are contradictions in terms. That's what the state of play was at that time. No one was calling what they were doing a democracy. Why were they not calling it a democracy? Because the key fundamental thinkers of that era were saying things like this. This is Rousseau on the left. The drawing of lots is more in the nature of democracy. In an aristocracy, voting is appropriate. You need to have random selection for it to be a democracy. If you have voting, you're going to get an aristocracy. Everyone knows that. Montesquieu was saying the same thing. Selection by lot is in the nature of democracy. Selection by choice is in the nature of aristocracy. The founding fathers of the US, who were very cultured, well-read individuals, had surely read these famous philosophers and knew that if they wanted democracy, they'd have to use random selection, so they didn't. What if we keep going back? Let's take our next step. You fall into a well of the Dark Ages. At least for democracy. Okay, the Dark Ages is a bit of a myth, but it's a popular myth. In fact, if you read John Keane, Life and Death of Democracy, he spends 200 pages tracing the sort of historical path of assemblies. He credits the church. He says we wouldn't have democracy if it wasn't for Jesus, in one of his lines, with holding assemblies and promoting this idea that assemblies populated by various representatives can actually come to legitimate decisions. Once we get back through the Dark Ages, where do we end up? Not very, probably easy to guess. We're back in ancient Athens. We're back at the birthplace of democracy. And you'll see Aristotle, it is thought to be democratic for the officers of government to be assigned by lot, for them to be elected oligarchic. This is where Montesquieu and Rousseau got their knowledge from. Why did he say that? Everyone knows in Athens was a direct democracy. There was the assembly that all free Athenian men could attend and discuss and vote on legislation. What's much less known is surrounding that assembly were a variety of institutions, virtually all of them populated using random selection. This device is called a cleritarian, and you can go to the Ancient Agora Museum in Athens and see a little chunk of one of these that's left over. It's a random selection device. You would have your little name tag and you would put it in a slot. There would be a metal pipe with a funnel. You'd get a vase full of white balls, you'd put a few black balls in there, shake it around, tip it into the funnel, and if a black ball came next to your name, you were chosen to go on the boule, the council of 400 people who would actually draft the legislation. Or you were chosen to go on the constitutional court, who would decide if the assembly had made an unconstitutional vote. Or you would be put on the jury to hear those cases, which is of course where modern day juries use this random selection from. There were some political posts that were elected. The general was elected. Maybe we should do that here. You vote for your general. But 95% of all the political offices were filled using random selection, and this is why random selection became synonymous with democracy for virtually 2,000 years until the last couple of hundred. Of course, we don't want to imitate Athens. I'm not suggesting we go back to Athens. Women were excluded, slaves were excluded, non-Athenians were excluded. I've talked about the assembly. That's the end of our backwards story. Where do we get here? I get to put up this. I'm a child of the 80s, so I'm very happy to be able to use that. We go back to the future. Okay. So do democracies equal elections? Or why, when you say democracy, do people go, elections? Is it because people think there is no alternative? And of course, what I'm here to try to convince you today is there is an alternative. It's called sortition or random selection. And I always imagine a chorus line coming on announcing this because people are like, what's this new word I've never heard before? And to me, it's a reincarnation of what a real democracy should be like and how a democracy could and should function. And that's why we are pushing it. But what is it? How do people do it today? So, basically, they get a mini-public. They randomly select a group of people. They stratify that sample to make sure that it's half men, half women, proportional, young, old, educated, less educated. They form this mini-public, this microcosm of society. You get the UK in a room, in a sense. You pour information into this mini-public. You crank a magic handle called deliberation, and what you get out is not public opinion. What you get out is informed, post-deliberative public judgment. Now, don't get me wrong. Every part of this process is controversial. You can critique it. Yeah? Who decides what information is poured into this mini-public? Who decides who the experts are who gets to talk to these people? Who decides what the process is to have deliberation? Who decides what's good deliberation, what's bad deliberation, when you've had enough deliberation? What happens to the output? Does the government of the day say, well, thanks very much, and throw it in the bin? Are they constrained to act as this mini public has told them? Every part of this process is open to criticism. The good news is people have been doing this now for decades, and they've worked out how to do it well. They've worked out how to make sure that the information is balanced, how to make sure the process is a good deliberative process, how to try to constrain governments to do what the mini publics say. But what's special about sortition? Well, it's basically a different type of representation. Anne Phillips, in a great book, Politics of Presence, which is arguing for women's quotas in Parliament, has this fantastic definition of the politics of the politics of ideas versus the politics of presence. The politics of what is in there, which ideas, versus who is in there. In theory, at the moment, we have a responsive political system. It doesn't actually matter if it's all old white men making the laws, because they're listening to their constituents and doing exactly what you want, etc. In the politics of presence, you say, no, it actually does. I actually want to see this room to reflect society, and then it actually doesn't matter if they ignore society, because society is in that room. They bring with them the ideas, the predispositions, the opinions of the wider society. So it's this shift from a politics of ideas to a politics of presence. And I think this shift has been going on for quite a few decades now with politics of identity. It's becoming important who is in the room, not just what they're saying. Here's my checklist of things I should have said. It's a representative random sample. I've mentioned that. It's a microcosm of society. It builds on the wisdom of crowds. What you find is that when you get these people in a room, that it's more, that they become more than the sum of their parts. Even if there's a few people of lower intellectual ability, let's say, and some clever people, what you find is they bounce ideas off each other. And whereas experts typically think in a sort of homogenous direction, if you get a diverse group of people in the room, they sort of explore the solution space and can actually come to better solutions. Scott Page, in a book, title's just gone through for a minute, coins this phrase, diversity can trump ability. Diverse people are actually smarter than able people across a broad spectrum of areas that you would want them to address in politics. If we actually got rid of elections and got rid of that whole system and just randomly selected people and had a representative House of Commons, this would mean the end of politicians. That's why I chose that provocative title for my book. Where's it happening? Short answer, everywhere. In Bolivia, there's some student councils that are using sortition to get the students onto their student councils. In Canada, in the province of British Columbia and Ontario, when they wanted to change their electoral form, they had a citizens' assembly meet for over a year to propose which electoral system they should move to. They then put it to a referendum. In British Columbia, 57% said, yeah, okay, we trust the citizens, but the government said, no, we're not going to do it unless 60% of the people say they want it. In Iceland, when they were creating the new constitution after the financial crisis, they used sortition as part of that process. Ireland is currently the poster child of citizens' assemblies. They had their first one a few years ago, which led to the referendum on same-sex marriage. They've just finished their second citizens' assembly, 99 randomly selected people. They talked about the constitutional ban on abortion, which is going to a referendum in May, and predicted to win. I suspect largely because people trust these citizens' assemblies. They trust what they say and the ideas they come to. We've mentioned G1000s, which we're hoping to bring to the UK. In Mongolia, they have legislated that any constitutional change must be preceded by a citizens' assembly, populated using... Ooh, that did it by itself. In Australia, recently, they were talking about whether South Australia should become a nuclear waste dump. They selected 350 people to talk about that over 6 days, I think it was. They said, no, we don't want your nuclear waste, thank you very much. There's all these examples happening all across the world, and these are just a few. We've actually started creating a map on the website, sortitionfoundation.org, where we're putting all the examples we know about. This is less than half of the examples that we know about. If anyone likes data entry and has a few hours spare, get in touch. The point being, they're really spreading. They're going. A few more details. So I talked about Ireland. They had 5 items, I think, on their agenda. How can Ireland become a leader in climate change? Should we have fixed-term parliaments? How should we do referenda better? The constitutional ban on abortion, maybe one other. They talked about all these topics after getting public input, after hearing from experts, then they came and made their proposal. What it does is it opens up this political space for change. The Irish Citizens' Assembly has stunned the politicians by the liberal nature of their proposals. And the politicians are then going, okay, I can actually say I'm pro removing this ban on abortion because the people have said they are. It legitimises that decision. The worldwide view on climate change and climate and energy was 10,000 citizens in 76 countries in June, just before the Copenhagen UN Climate Summit. In 2009, they brought 340 people from across the EU together with simultaneous translation, talking about climate change, talking about migration. They measured the shift in opinion of people coming into that room and as they go out of that room. It's very interesting. I've talked about our proposal to institute a second chamber in the Scottish Parliament, and of course here you could also, I would like to promote House of Lords reform and say let's have a People's Senate, a People's Chamber. To me, this would be a great first step. It doesn't threaten the politicians too much. They could actually appear to be innovative, democratic, and then you would have these 2 houses, one that is elected politicians, one that is a representative random sample of people. I suspect, my prediction would be at that point, people would be like, they make good decisions and they're just busy doing their usual political backstabbing, etc., etc. Why do we need those elected ones? That would be the next step. In France and Belgium, these ideas are perhaps even more advanced. After holding the G1000, etc., there's discussion to replace the Belgian Senate with the People's Parliament. There's a French campaign, Senate Citoyen, to do the same in France. Macron is about to announce his European citizens' consultations, which there's a whole group of organisations pushing will have a citizens' assembly component to that. The idea spreads. Of course, it's not all bread and roses. It's not a panacea. It won't be that then everything's fixed. But what I find, anecdotally at least, and even actually there is some evidence emerging, that people typically come out more progressive from these sorts of forums. They come out with a more collective, long-term, broad view of the problems that are facing our society. It opens up the political space. It's good for political hot potatoes. The politicians can handball or hand pass these questions to these citizens. Process and independence are really crucial. Process. You can't just throw randomly selected people in a room and say, right, do it. You have to facilitate that process and you have to do it well. You could almost do more damage if it was done badly. You get increased trust in the outcomes, and groups of people are clever. It's often attacked from both sides of the political spectrum. In Ireland, the pro-choice, the pro-life side was like, no, this is completely illegitimate. This is what we have politicians for. Of course, they were scared of a change to the status quo. But the pro-choice side also attacked it. Why are you just kicking the can down the road? Why don't you pass legislation now? They've become much quieter once they've seen what actually come out of that process and the fact that it seems to be going the way they would like. They can be relatively expensive, a couple $100,000 for a weekend, depending on if you're getting people from all over the country, etc. I think democracy is worth it. Can they be empowered or ignored? Governments can ignore them, governments can do what they say. This is still something we're working on. In Gdansk, there's a citizens' jury in that city, and the council has committed to be bound by the decision if it has an 80% supermajority. This is a start. The New Democracy Foundation in Australia will not hold one of these summits unless the government commits to tabling the report in Parliament and publicly responding to the recommendations in that. That's a first step. Quick talk about accountability, because if you say, let's get rid of elections and just use random selection, almost always the first question is, but how will you hold these people to account? How will they be held accountable? Because most people imagine that to hold a political class to account, you have to be able to elect them in or out or something. I'd like to challenge that view. This might be one aspect, but of course, an independent, inquisitive media is crucial, especially between elections. You need the media to demand the reasons for politicians to do what they do and to publicise those reasons. Of course, this is why you should support movements to diversify media, to not concentrate the media as we have. NGOs are crucial, civil society. They monitor the legislation that politicians are passing, and they're very trusted, they're highly trusted. The judiciary is really crucial. You need an independent judiciary to enforce the constraints on politicians, on the sorts of laws they can pass, on how they wield power, on obviously corruption, etc. And of course people power. We need people. You have to enforce civil liberties, the right to protest, the right to demonstrate, the right to go on the street and say, we think you're doing the wrong thing. So what you need, I think, is a systemic view of accountability. And in fact, if you look at Russia, if you look at Turkey, if you look at Hungary, these illiberal democracies, okay, they tightly constrain the electoral process, but what they also do is they crush the independent media. They outlaw civil society. They buy off the judiciary, and they arrest you if you go and protest on the street. Why do they do that? Because they know that accountability is a systemic thing. So if you just eliminate this one thing, you can still have accountability. These people who will be randomly selected will be in office for a few years, will then have to leave, still have to justify their reasons, still have to respond to protesters, still have to be will be scrutinised by civil society. It's still an accountable system. So is sortition the future of democracy? Well, I live in a sortition bubble, and to me it's happening everywhere. I try to step out of that bubble sometimes, but it's getting harder and harder. It's becoming this gold standard, to me, of citizen engagement all across the world. When people say, okay, we're going to do some citizen engagement, they use sortition. It was an academic thing at the start. It's moving to social movements. It's moving to governments, local, national. The next step is to move from these one-off assemblies that we see happening all over the planet to the institutionalisation of sortition. We need a permanent body. Let's get rid of the House of Lords and make a sortition body or something. So, if you want to join the Sortition Foundation, you can just go to our website, sortitionfoundation.org, put your email address in, you can become a member and help us support, give us resources to campaign on these topics. If you want to read more, you can buy my book over there for 10 quid later on. I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion. Thanks.